that going. There we go. Again, I'm David Kramer, director of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our book talk series. Today, we will hear from Professor Robin Judd for speaking about her absolutely wonderful book, important topic, engaging, superb read, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. In the promotional material, you saw a bio, Professor of History at Ohio State, and specialist in gender studies, Holocaust studies, and other things, several of which will relate to what she's presenting today. I just want to remind you to stay on mute, please. If you stray off of it, I will easily be able to find you and remute you. We will have time at the end of the session for questions. It would be better if you are able over the course of the presentation or at the end to put the questions into chat so I can collect them and deliver them to our author. If again, at the end, if there's some time and we can go off of chat, we can do a little bit of that as well. The only other thing I want to add is that we are going to end this session a couple of minutes before the hour, so please anticipate that as we go through the schedule. Robin, it's really a pleasure to welcome you, and I could say I give you the floor, but we're not sharing a floor here, so I give you the screen would be a better way to describe it, please.
I'll happily take the screen. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for being here with me this afternoon to talk about my book project, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. Let me try to share my screen, and there we are.
There you go, working extremely well.
Great. So today what I'd love to do is talk with you about this book that just came out in December, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. And later I'll put a link to the book in the chat for those who are interested. My hope is that we'll kind of do three things together. First, I'll introduce the book and give you a little bit of background. Second, I'll speak about why it was that I really wanted to study Jewish war brides and what I think we have to learn from studying Jewish war brides. And then rather than trying to give like the entire narrative arc of my book in 35 minutes, I thought I would pull out two couples that can tell us disparate stories about their wartime and post-war experience, but that we can use as a way of narrating the Jewish war bride experience. And those will be Flory and Harry, Sala and Abe. So first, just a bit of background that has everything to do with this project and nothing to do with the project. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term war bride, and of course with this audience of folks who are affiliated with the Jewish Theological Seminary, you are probably familiar, right, with the term war bride, which is an ancient term. I mean, we have a number of moments in the biblical narrative where we talk about what happens if someone is to take a bride as a captive of war. A war bride in the more modern sense is slightly different. In this context, we are referring to a civilian living abroad who marries a member of an occupying or warring military personnel. So American military personnel who marry French women who are when they're serving abroad, or Japanese women when they're serving abroad, or British soldiers who marry women from Palestine in 1920 or 1921. These were all considered war brides. And different countries develop policies around war brides at different times. So in the British and Canadian context, there's a much longer history, formal history of war brides. The British formal history is the longest. The Canadian, is because it's a Commonwealth country, develops sort of clearer policies around World War I. The US long had a history of war brides. The term is invoked as early as the 1880s, but it really becomes informal usage during the First World War. There were hundreds of thousands of war brides during the Second World War. Only a portion of these were Jewish. The majority of war brides, about 200,000 or so, come from Britain and Australia and come to the United States. There are around 70,000 who come from Britain and Australia and go to Canada. There are around 40,000 who come from other parts of the world into Britain. And so if we're going to look at the total war bride population, it's about 400,000 war brides during and after the Second World War that are coming from all over the world into places like the United States, Britain, Canada, even the Soviet Union. For my project, I don't look at the Soviet Union. I wish I could, but I don't have Russian. So today we'll be talking about my project, which asks about the Jewish women and men, you could be a male war bride, the Jewish women and men who marry members of the Allied military personnel from mostly the United States, Britain, and Canada, with some eye to some of the auxiliary forces, like the Free French or the Polish government that was in exile, or some of the auxiliary leagues that the British military has. So I didn't come into this project because I was fascinated by war brides. Instead, I came into this project because there were two sort of impulses, two kind of really significant variables in my life that made me interested in the question around Jewish war brides. One has to do with the fabulously stylish woman in the patterned sweater sitting in her Americanization class. That's my grandmother, Robin Judd, who was a Jewish war bride. I knew about her experiences, limited amount. My grandmother was wary about talking about her past during the war, but my grandmother was a survivor from Czechoslovakia, really from Slovakia. She married the man that I knew as my grandfather, who was a member of the American military personnel, a member of the Blue Devils. He had fought in Italy and then had made his way to Austria. But I always thought her story was relatively unique, and especially since she was unwilling to reveal too many details. And I talk about what I learned about her story in the conclusion of my book. So if you want to know more, you'll have to get the book. But I knew that she was a war bride, and so her story had always fascinated me. And there were various moments in my life where I tried to sort of think a little bit more about this kind of category of Jewish women, but I didn't really think about it as a historical category. It wasn't something that I was hyper aware of. And that began to change as I started reading more of the memoirs written by female Holocaust survivors. And I should sort of take a step aside and say that my training as for my PhD, where I did a PhD in German history and in Jewish history, focused much more on the 19th and early 20th century, but kind of moved in as anyone would move in into and through the 20th century. I TA'd for the history of the Holocaust course, but it was really only when I came to The Ohio State University and started to teach all of the modern Jewish history courses and started to teach the history of the Holocaust courses that I began to read more of the memoirs written by female survivors. And what struck me as I was reading these memoirs is that so many of them end with meeting the men that they are going to marry. So Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life, one of the sort of best known memoirs written by a female survivor and one of the earliest female survivor memoirs published in the United States, she ends her memoir with meeting her liberator, Kurt. When I decided to assign a memoir written by a Canadian survivor, I assigned The Tulips Are Red, a wonderful, wonderful memoir where Leisha Rose ends her discussion of her experience fighting in the resistance with meeting her husband, Isaac Rose, a Canadian chaplain, literally on the streets as the fighting is ongoing. When I assigned a book by a British survivor, I Light a Candle, the first Holocaust memoir written by a female survivor in Britain. She ends with being liberated uh, by her soon-to-be husband, and so on and on and on and on. Seed of Sarah, Judith Magyar Isaacson, Lala's story, written by Lala Fishman, Clara's story, written by Clara Isaacson. There were so many memoirs that were written by these female survivors who had met their husbands at or soon after liberation. And it made me think about a moment that I knew about historically, namely, when was it that the American public had one of its sort of most pervasive, widespread introduction to Holocaust survivors? And there had been earlier ones, absolutely, but one of the sort of most poignant and one that was geared most to a non-Jewish audience was the 1953 episode This Is Your Life, where the guest of the evening, the awardee, the honoree, was Hannah Kuhner, the wife of the television and film executor Walter Kuhner. And we learn her story, and she talks about her internment in Auschwitz and in other camps, and learned about the Holocaust. And of course, she's married to an American GI. That's how she comes to the United States. And so, as I was teaching my History of the Holocaust class and finishing my first book, which looked at the debates over circumcision and kosher butchering in 19th and 20th century Germany, I started to ask around about these Jewish war brides. And I wanted to know, like, what was their story? Who has written about them? How was their experience different from the experiences of other war brides? In what ways were they part of survivor communities? And as I asked my colleagues and mentors and friends who work on DPs and work on survivors, they all sort of affirmed the interest. They thought it was a great question. But because these individuals were able to immigrate to the United States, to Britain, or to Canada through separate channels, they all came as sort of war brides or war fiancés because they were sort of seen as a separate category, even in North Africa or in Europe, after they meet members of the military personnel. Because of that, they weren't seen as sort of fitting in with the larger survivor community. And so for me, it became really important to think about how we could sort of ask questions about these Jewish war brides. And you can hear, perhaps, and hopefully it's not bothering you too much, one of our dogs is very enthusiastic about the war bride experience. And so he is adding a little bit of his own special harmony. So why should we talk about Jewish war brides? And here we have one of my favorite photos. This is Isaac Rose, who marries Leisha Rose, and this is him. He was a chaplain, a Jewish chaplain with the Canadian military. And so why should we talk about these Jewish war brides and the military personnel like Isaac Rose who married them? Well, one of the things that I argue in my book, and I really try to make the book something that would be of interest to lay readers as well as scholars of the Holocaust and of Jewish history, is that I think the Jewish war brides tell us a lot about the difficulties of surviving in the aftermath of trauma. Now, this is not unique to war brides only. I think one of the very exciting developments in Holocaust studies in the last 10 or 15 years or so has been to kind of complicate the liberation experience and to complicate, how we understand survival. But the war brides, in part because of their in-betweenness, in part because they're not fitting into one community or another community, they're wrestling with survival in their own particular way. And when they reflect on it, they're reflecting on it in their own particular way. The war brides are allow us into a way of telling a story about Reconstruction that is uneven. It can be really prolonged and sometimes unhappy. And again, not necessarily unique to the war bride experience, but it highlights the ways in which they don't always necessarily fit into the non-Jewish war bride experience, and they don't always fit into what we might call sort of the larger majority survivor experience. One of the things that I really enjoy about studying the war brides is the multiple communities in which they take part, because the war brides that I study are constantly bouncing back and forth between and among displaced people communities, among returnee communities, among refugee communities, among other war bride communities. And so one of the things that I try to trace is, at what moments do these individuals feel like they belong? And at what moments do they feel like they don't belong? And in fact, the title of this book, Between Two Worlds, actually comes from a quote of one of the war brides who argued that when she was living in Munich in a home that had been rented for her by her military fiance, she felt trapped between two worlds. On the one hand, she had access to the military base in Munich, to the PX in Munich, to all kinds of medical care. She had her own room in an apartment, right? But on the other hand, right, she also felt distanced from all these communities. So it's these post-war communities and senses of unbelonging that I find totally fascinating. This project allows me to think about questions surrounding marriage, immigration, and citizenship, and how they sometimes became triangulated. That, as we'll see in my conversation today, there was an understanding among many survivors and many members of the military personnel, Jewish and not, that marriage could be a ticket out of North Africa or out of Europe. And so the ways in which marriage, immigration, and citizenship get brought together by Jewish survivors, by members of the military personnel, by chaplains, by military commanders, by immigration officials, right? So as we move into and through the Second World War, questions about marriage abroad become questions that within them are vested really important questions concerning immigration and citizenship. And so to kind of look at all of these things, in the book, I try to study 5 different moments. I begin with liberation. So how is it that studying these Jewish war brides tell us a kind of messy, complicated, but yet fascinating story of liberation? What can we learn about encounter? Like, I was just fascinated. How is it that these people meet one another? And then after they meet one another, how do they get from meeting, like at Bergen-Belsen, to courtship and marriage? Like, what are the steps? What does that look like in a war-torn Europe? Or like in the case of the Roses, as the war is still ongoing? What's their story of immigration, right? And as I hinted at earlier, Canada and Britain both had very clear policies around immigration of war brides as we move into and through the Second World War. The US develops its policies into and through the Second World War, with sort of the pinnacle of that being the December 1945 law that will allow war brides to circumvent already existing immigration quotas. So it meant that after December 1945, it was much easier to immigrate as a war bride to the United States than in any other category. And then lastly, I look to the early years. What does it look like when they get off the train or in some cases plane and have to settle in these new homes where very often they don't speak the language, they don't have the culture, and in some cases their spouses are still serving abroad. So it wasn't uncommon for the women to immigrate to the United States, Britain, or Canada before the men were demobilized. And I'm using sort of gendered language here because the vast majority of our war brides are women, but there were male war brides. And in fact, if we think back to that Hannah Kohner example from This Is Your Life, the television show This Is Your Life featured three different Holocaust survivors. Of the three survivors, two were war brides. One, the first, was Hannah Kohner, and the second was a male war bride. So it was possible to be a male war bride. So let me then introduce our two couples, Flory and Harry, whose amazing wedding photo we see here in Bari, Italy, and Sala and Abe. And I love using these two examples, both because one couple ends up in the United States and another couple ends up in Canada, but also because Flory is a Sephardic Jew and her experience is a very different one as she makes her way from Yugoslavia into and through Split to Kursala and then eventually to Bari, Italy. Her experience is very different from Sala Solart's, a Polish woman who, as we'll see, is moving back and forth across Poland into Germany and never returns back to Poland. She eventually marries Abe in Paris. They go to Palestine and then they come to Canada. So the fact that their stories are so different is really helpful. So Flory Cabillo was her maiden name. Jagoda was actually born in Sarajevo, but she grows up in Zagreb, living with her mother and stepfather. When the Nazis invade Yugoslavia, she and her family move to Split. They do so separately. She goes first with her accordion. And in fact, I had the incredible honor of interviewing Flory, and she had several accordions out for me to see, but one of the accordions she had was her accordion from Europe. So Flory and her family go to Split. In Split, they find that the Italians have occupied the region, that there are still dramatic restrictions on Jewish life, perhaps a little less restrictive than in Zagreb, but still pretty horrific. They are then interned on the island of Kursala, which has two internment camps. Flory remembered that kind of moment with more fondness than the time in Split. They had actually hoped that they would remain in Kursala for the rest of the war, but they are evacuated by British and partisan forces as the Germans begin to overtake the area. And they are evacuated to Bari while there's still fighting taking place around Bari. So when she is quote unquote liberated and brought to Bari by the British, and the British forces have pretty much held Bari, there's still ongoing fighting outside of Bari, and it's unclear that they have been truly liberated. Sala Solart's story is a little bit different. Sala is born in the smaller town of Serac, which is outside of Warsaw. She experiences the war far earlier than Flory because, of course, she's living in an area that will see German invasion in 1939. She remembered the bombs flying overhead. Her family goes to Warsaw, where she already has a number of siblings living there. They settle in Warsaw, but they find it incredibly difficult. They're unable to all stay together. There are just limited resources in 39 as the fighting is still ongoing. And over the course of that first year in Warsaw, they see all of the horrific laws that the Germans implement with the invasion and occupation, as well as the building of the Warsaw Ghetto. And indeed, she is imprisoned, incarcerated in two different ghettos. She begins in the Warsaw Ghetto. She's eventually brought to Lublin, to the ghetto there. From that, she then is deported by the Nazis to several different camps, to Majdanek, to Auschwitz, to Ravensbrück. She's then brought to Dachau, and from there she is forced onto a death march in the spring of 1945 that ostensibly was to go further north, but they are liberated by the Soviets in April in the small Saxon town of Oschatz. And even at liberation, there's a handful of the women that she had been with the death march on, and they don't understand any of the languages around them. She has Yiddish and Polish. She's picked up a few German words. She's liberated by the Soviets. She has no Russian, right? And so for liberation for both of these women is an incredibly vulnerable, incredibly raw, incredibly difficult experience. For both of them, it's within a few months of liberation that they encounter the individuals that they are going to eventually marry. And I like this example because it's a little bit different than the Gerda Klein meeting the spouse sort of literally at liberation, although I'm happy to talk about those examples too. We have that in a number of different sort of settings. And Sala meet their spouses at certain moments that they attribute really Jewish values to. And part of what struck me about encounter stories was that no matter where the couples met, whether they met in a camp, on a death after a death march, whether they met in fighting, whether they met in synagogue services, whether they met on the street, there was a way in which the story became imbued with a Jewish meaning. What I write in the book, using the language of Alon Confino's sort of A World Without Jews, right? The encounter stories, the courtship stories, the marriage stories are all ways for these couples to create a Europe and a North Africa that's now a world with Jews again. Even if the Jews are not going to stay in these locations, there's a way in which Jews get placed on the map, on the topography of a Europe and a North Africa that had been envisioned as possibly being without its Jews. And if we look at the story of Sala and we look at the story of Flori, we see that getting imbued, right? Sala meets Abe at Rosh Hashanah services at the DP camp in Hanover. This is in September of 1945. She is miserable, and again, talking about liberation as a hard, difficult, vulnerable experience. She had actually tried to escape to Palestine in the summer of 1945 and was thwarted from doing so. She is then forcibly returned to the DP camp in Hanover, where she sort of describes feeling often like a monkey in a cage when military personnel, particularly Jewish military personnel, come to visit. She says in her interviews, I didn't want any Rahmanis. I didn't want any pity from people. And yet she becomes quite enamored with this Canadian soldier who sits down with her during Rosh Hashanah and in a flawless Yiddish begins to speak to her. And it's that sort of moment of the linguistic and cultural recognition that opens Sala up a little bit and doesn't have her see Abe as her future husband. Abe is a little bit quicker in his letters and writings to suggest a future with Salah than Salah is to suggest a future with Abe. But but Abe, who is the son of a Jewish butcher in Montreal, speaks flawless Yiddish, has throughout his time in Germany and in France, had tried to meet with the Jewish communities where he had been. He has this real kind of affinity to seek out the Jews. And so for their encounter story is a story that has this trope of kind of coming together during Rosh Hashanah. So does Florrie and Harry. Even though Florrie and Harry meet at the army base, the British Depot Center in Bari, which is where Florrie had a job, even though they meet there, the story has everything to do with Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because it's the fall of 1944. Harry Yagoda has just arrived in Bari. He comes to the Depot Center to get certain equipment that he needs. And he sees Florrie, this very attractive, blonde woman, clearly a DP, because she has no English, even though she's working at the British military base. And he tries in a mixture of different languages to ask her to go to a dance with him. There's an officers' dance that evening. She declines. He somehow encourages her to at least ask her parents if she can get permission. She takes him to her parents' apartment, and there he sees the Rosh Hashanah Machzor, and it's in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and he realizes that they're Jewish, and he asks them if they're Jews, and they end up going to the dance, albeit with Florrie's parents in tow. And that seems, again, to mark their encounter story. So often encounters have something to do with Jewishness. They also have something to do with non-Jewishness, which is to say that in some of the encounter stories, I often would see things about the fact that these women didn't necessarily look Jewish or that the men didn't look Jewish. And part of what I write about in the book is like, well, what does that mean? You know, why was it that some of these men and women in their letters from that period or later in their interviews or their diaries or in the reflections from the chaplain's reports, why was it that they sort of tried to introduce this strange binary, right? This strange contradiction of labeling this as a Jewish space, but also sort of working out some of these anti-Semitic tropes that they themselves had absorbed over the past several years. In the book, I then move to courtship and marriage. I find it fascinating that these couples somehow move from meeting one another when, in some cases, like Florrie and Harry here, they don't have a language that they can share, right? Harry has some Yiddish and English. Florrie has a little bit of Italian. She has Ladino. She's got Serbian and Croatian. She has a little bit of French. I'm feeling like there's another language or two that she had on her list. But how is it that they find ways to develop courtships? And I devote much time to that in the book because I just found it so amazing that they kind of found ways to move from encounter through marriage. Like, how is it that they spend time? What are their activities? Many of the activities, not all, are Jewish in nature. They go to Zionist meetings. They go to synagogue services. They do volunteer work in the Jewish community. They work with things like the Joint or Bricha, the illegal movement to get Jews into Palestine. So the courtships are stories of sort of shared affinity and shared interests. And there's a moment in these courtships when the couples decide that there's real value in getting married. Very often, the value has to do with immigration, right? A recognition that by marrying Salah, by marrying Florrie, by marrying Gerda, right, that's a way of getting them to the United States or Canada or Britain. The challenge is marriage and immigration is not up to the military personnel and the survivor. Marriage and immigration is up to the military officials. And the military develop very complicated procedures and processes that structure how a couple will marry, what the paperwork is, what the interview system will look like, who officiates. And that changes slightly over time. It changes from 43 into late spring of 45, right after the war. It changes again over the summer and fall of 45, and again in the fall of 1946. But these couples that I look at are going to have particular experiences vis-a-vis these policies. Perhaps it's because they don't have the paperwork that other war brides might have. Perhaps it's because the medical examinations are going to be particularly traumatic. So in the chapter on courtship and marriage, I look both at how these couples get to the point where they want to marry, but also what are the structures in place that will dictate whether or not they can marry. Marriage is vetted very seriously because there's an understanding that marriage and immigration are linked. While there's still a possibility after marriage that immigration can get retracted, and one of the chapters in my book is devoted to two cases where indeed that's what happens. Allied officials understand that the majority of the cases where marriage takes place, those women and men are going to immigrate to the new homes in Britain, the US, or in England. I then look at the question of, well, like, how do they immigrate? What's the process? How long does it take? Because once couples marry, they have two decisions, at least two decisions to make. One is, are they going to take advantage of the war bride travel that is given to them by the US and Canadian governments? That the US and Canada set up a war bride bureau and system that will oversee immigration and will guide the entire process from leaving, let's say, Antwerp to get to Paris, to go to Le Havre, to then make their way to Ellis Island, for example, right? The travel on the ship, clearance, all of that is overseen by a system that's set up for the war brides. That means that there are war bride clearing centers, war bride houses, war bride hotels, war bride ships that may also have other DPs or refugees or demobilized soldiers on them, but the war brides live together. There's a war bride clearing space at Ellis Island. So couples decide, do they want to go that route? In which case, it's totally covered for them. They don't have to worry about which ship they're going to go on or how they're going to get there, because the US government or the Canadian government dictate that. The downside is that also means they don't control how long it will take. And it can take a long time. If they have the funds or the resources, they could potentially buy an airplane ticket and fly from London, from Paris to London, and then from London to LaGuardia. And some of the couples that I look at chose that. So I love this immigration piece because, first of all, these couples have to make all kinds of decisions. They're following rumor culture, and then they're stuck on these boats or stuck in these clearing spaces where they're kept with other war brides, but the people with whom they may share the same language, the same culture, the same affinity, the same religion, those people are kept separate. And so that between two worlds really meant something there and then. The last chapter that I look at is what happens when they get to their new homes. Because for most of our couples, not all, but about 90% of them, they are going to move in with their spouse's family. Very few of our demobilized military personnel can afford their own homes after the war ends, immediately after the war ends. And even if they can, there is a worldwide housing shortage in the aftermath of the Second World War. And so most couples will settle with the um, usually husband's family. Um, in some cases, as I alluded to before, the war brides will come separately, maybe even months or a year before they are reunited with their spouses. Many are settling in homes where they don't speak the language, where even if they share religious customs, they're unfamiliar. In some cases, they're moving into homes of families that are really resentful of the fact that their sons or brothers married individuals who were not the individuals that they had hoped that they would marry in the first place. And so part of what I ask is, how is it that these individuals create new lives for themselves? What kinds of survivor networks do they take advantage of? What kinds of war bride networks do they take advantage of? Because the war bride clubs continue to exist in the United States and Canada, to a lesser degree, Britain. And so there are going to be opportunities for the women and men that I study to take advantage both of war bride opportunities, child rearing lessons, cooking lessons, English language lessons, as well as survivor network opportunities, child rearing lessons, cooking lessons, English language lessons, right? And so in some cases, we'll see some of these war brides taking advantage of English classes, let's say, at both the National Council of Jewish Women and at the American Red Cross, right? Because they're going to be in both of those different kinds of communities. I will say, sort of to end, and then I'll open it for questions because I do want to leave time, that for many of the women and men that I study, they talk about feeling at home at the moment at which they actually have homes. That as important as having children is to the narrative of acculturation, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, for many of them, it's once they've had their children and they've moved into their own apartment or house, and beginning to feel like they have a bit more control or sovereignty in their own space, that's of feeling at home. So I'll end there. I'll stop sharing and see if people have questions. And I just put the book information in the chat for anyone who wants it. It looks like there's a hand from Tybal.
Yeah,
I have.
I'm sorry, Tybal. Just 1 second. There was in the in the chat there was a
Great.
question before that,
Perfect.
and then
Go for it.
since Tybal wants to speak, we'll do that too. So
However
from
you
Deb
want to do it.
Magidson, how much do you think that non-Jewish military appreciated that Jews frequently have an unspoken bond beyond religion? Right. And then the comment goes on to say, I read the book and was particularly intrigued by how diverse the Jewish survivors were. One cannot assume that the survivors were all Yiddish speakers from Eastern Europe. One question and one very good point. How do you want to respond?
No, thanks so much. That's such a great point, and I'm so glad that you kind of brought out one of the things that I really wanted this book to show, which was that the survivor experience was an incredibly disparate and diverse experience. And so I tried to bring in, those Ladino speakers, those Arabic speakers, those, French speakers, who, might not have any German, might not have any Yiddish. So to the question about the non-Jews and appreciation, I mean, certainly it really, just as I might say that there were Jews, Jewish members of the Jewish military who might not have been as involved in the efforts around recovery. There were non-Jews who were not as involved in the efforts of recovery. So I don't want to kind of paint like just a huge broad stroke about all Jews or about all non-Jews. There are a number of non-Jews who marry Jewish survivors and become incredibly involved themselves in the question of recovery and rehabilitation. Many of them tend to be communists, so there's like that whole other kind of political narrative at play. I think it really depends, to Bev's question, about time and place, and is this a group that is going to be involved in recovery or reconstruction efforts with rebuilding synagogues? And certainly, there's no way that the synagogues could have been rebuilt across Germany, France, Italy, without the involvement of Jewish and non-Jewish military personnel. So we do have some appreciation. All of that said, and I don't really write about this so much in my work, it kind of goes outside of my work, but Michael Berkowitz writes about this in his book, Around the DP Experience. Part of the challenge of liberation and part of the challenge of occupation, particularly with running the DP camps, is that at times it would reinforce stereotypes that individuals already had about minority groups. Like when liberating and seeing people who are, skeletal-like and grabbing food, if an individual already had a presupposition to thinking about Jews as greedy and grubby and dirty, then liberation experience could have reinforced that supposition, right? And so that's part of the dynamic that I try to look at in the book. And again, Michael Berkowitz's book, I think, is really good about that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Tybal, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to do this in
No.
order. Go right ahead.
Sorry about that. I hadn't seen the chat. So I have two very different questions, neither of which maybe you have an answer to. But early, you used a very interesting locution when you said the man you knew as your grandfather, which made me think that maybe he wasn't your biological grandfather and your grandmother had come as a war bride with a child, which would be extremely unusual. That was one. And the other is, and this would be quite difficult to find except through extensive searches for government records or anecdotal, like the Christopher Eisgruber's child doing research and discovering grandmother was actually. But did you come across Jewish war brides who, after marrying or immigrating, passed as always having been Christian or not Jewish?
Okay, so the unfair, snarky response to the first question, and not really snarky, but tongue in cheek, is read the book. Read the conclusion. Yeah. So my grandfather was not my biological grandfather, although he was my grandfather as I knew him, and it wasn't as uncommon as you would think of military personnel marrying women with children, if those women and children were in hiding. So again, not majority experience at all, but my grandmother wasn't the only one like her, even though probably she would have said that she was unique and nobody in the world was like her. There were a couple of war brides that I found, and in fact, I had lots of really helpful conversations with friends who are professors of ethics around when I was writing my book, about what happens when I find materials that push up against the narratives that families have about their own family's history. How does one handle that? So yeah, I did find stories where it turned out that there were, let's say, the war bride was a Jewish survivor, and that part of this family narrative had never had, maybe the war bride piece was a narrative, but the Jewishness wasn't. In some cases, the war bride and the Jewishness wasn't part of the narrative. And we know families are complicated, right? And how the stories that we hand down are complicated. We create, part of what I write about in the book is the ways in which these couples create realities that they have to live with for their entire lives. Like, what does it mean to liberate somebody and then marry that person and stay married to that person for 60 years, right? And so that's an amazing thing. And yet one creates a narrative about what it looked like when that person encountered that person. So I do think a lot, and always try to kind of channel a lot of compassion to my historical actors who made choices that maybe I don't understand, but whose papers allow me insight into a world that I just had never even imagined before I sat down to do the research. So thank you so much for those questions.
Robin, I want to ask actually, I mean, you deserve a lot of credit, both in the book and in your presentation now, for recognizing and highlighting the fact that Jewish experience was frequently not uniquely Jewish experience, that the same dynamics often affected other groups, communities as well. I read the book in the aftermath of October 7th and got to page 24. Where I read, it would be misleading to suggest that concerns about sexual pressures existed only in the East. Certainly the ubiquity of sexual violence in the Soviet zones was unique, but American, British, and Canadian soldiers also participated in acts of banditry, sexual assault, and sexual humiliation. So I wondered to myself as I was reading this, and this was at a time that focus was being brought on both the phenomenon and denial of the sexual violence that had occurred on October 7th. To what degree do you think that the dynamics of war, this is a gender question, the dynamics of war, which are about domination and control, are often acted out in the domination and control of women by men, even leading to humiliation and violence?
I think it's such an important question, and it was um it it was one of the very difficult terrains for me to navigate, particularly when I was doing my own interviews with the women and men that I spoke with. 20 years ago, we didn't have the literature around the inexorable links between sexual violence and war and sexual violence and power. In the last 2 decades, the literature and Rachel Seidel in terms of the Jewish context, but there are others in terms of the non-Jewish context. Right now, it's escaping me the author, but the What Soldiers Do is the book that looks at American GIs and rape in France. That there's a particularity to the gender, to the use of sexual violence within war. And for those of us who study as historians, and so we look at the past, and particularly if we're engaging with our historical actors, this is a very difficult thing to talk about. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the silences that some of the people that I was interviewing offered, or the metaphors that they used. And here again, to kind of giving the shout out to Rachel Seidel and others who have helped us understand, what are key kind of words that individuals use, or body parts, hair, for example, that when women use, they're often using it differently than men. And often that has some kind of connotation to sexual violence or sexual humiliation.
Okay, thank you. It's a very important answer, and I appreciate it. Our time has come to an end. I wish we had more time. I recommend to everybody, if you have not yet read the book, you can hear all of the many very important things that it discusses. And we are proud, we, the Library of JTS, to have been able to sponsor this talk and to provide it to others. So thank you, Robin. And I invite you all to come back for other talks that we sponsor over the course of time. Okay, so bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.